April 7th, 1945. Before the sun has cleared the hills beyond Tokyo Bay, a dull red glow stains the eastern sky. The haze of smoke from the night's fires hangs heavy over the capital, mixing with the sea fog rolling in. For men who have lived for months under the constant threat of air raid sirens, the color of dawn itself has come to mean danger. At Chofu Airfield, about 20 miles west of the Imperial Palace, the ground crews of the 73rd Sentai move like ghosts through the morning mist. Their breath steams in the cold air as they haul ammunition crates and check fuel hoses. Above them, a lone crow circles, cawing once before it vanishes into the ominous red light. Captain Masao Swanaga stands beside his aircraft, his leather gloves tucked neatly under one arm. He's a veteran pilot, having flown since the war's beginning, from Manchuria to the Philippines, and most recently, Okinawa. 3 long years of combat sorties have carved lines into his face, making him look older than his 28 years. He gazes east, toward Tokyo. The distant city glimmers faintly beneath the haze, completely unaware of what this morning will bring. Behind him, his ground chief, Sergeant Yamamoto, curses softly at a stubborn ignition lead. Swanaga allows himself a faint smile. He knows every cough and sputter of his aircraft's Nakajima Ha-45 engine, every vibration of its frame. It's an extension of his own body. Inside the operations hut, a young radio operator adjusts his headphones, the hum of static filling the small wooden room. He scribbles a note on his pad. Multiple contacts, bearing 175, distance unknown. It begins like almost every other morning. A report of bombers, heavy ones, heading north. Another B-29 raid. Another desperate scramble to intercept the silver giants that can level entire districts in a single pass. But this transmission carries a tremor of uncertainty the operator has never heard before. Unknown fighters accompanying the bombers. Repeat, unknown fighters. He says it twice as if he can't believe the words himself. Fighters? Here? Over Tokyo? The captain steps inside just as the words echo from the receiver. Fighters? He asks, his voice sharp. The operator just nods, his eyes wide. Swanaga's mind races, calculating distances like an abacus. Saipan, Guam, Okinawa. None of them are within range for American fighters. No US fighter has ever crossed that vast span of ocean to reach the Japanese mainland. It's simply not possible. He buttons his flight jacket, the leather stiff from the cold and the salt air. Alert the squadron, he orders quietly, his voice betraying no emotion. The field explodes into a frenzy of controlled chaos. Mechanics yank away wheel chocks, propellers roar to life, and the sharp biting smell of high-octane fuel burns the air. At 0610 hours, Swanaga climbs into his cockpit. The curved glass of the canopy reflects the crimson dawn. Sergeant Yamamoto leans up, shouting to be heard above the powerful engine. Unknown aircraft, approaching from the south. Swanaga frowns. From the south? He repeats. That would mean they're coming from the direction of the open sea. The Ki-84 Hayate trembles as its propeller bites into the cold air. Swanaga taxis toward the runway, his fighter rolling past rows of bomb-scarred hangars and windows shattered by previous raids. From somewhere beyond the city, a new sound begins to roll in, the low rhythmic hum of hundreds of engines. Every man on the airfield freezes for an instant. They have heard this sound far too often to mistake it, the approach of the B-29 super fortress. But the rhythm is different today. It's deeper, uneven. There are smaller engines mixed in with the giants. The captain's pulse quickens. His intuition, honed by years of combat, screams that something unprecedented is approaching. He closes the canopy, sealing himself inside the glass bubble that has served as both his armor and his prison for so long. Through the crackle of the radio comes a voice from headquarters, strained and uncertain. All units, emergency scramble. Unidentified fighters over Tokyo Bay. Swanaga tightens his harness. The Ha-45 engine coughs once, then roars to its full power. As his fighter lifts from the concrete, the world below shrinks away. The hangars, the trucks, the waving figure of Yamamoto, all of it swallowed by the rising haze. Ahead, the crimson sky deepens to a blood orange. and somewhere in that brilliant, terrible light, glints of silver move with an unnatural, terrifying purpose. Captain Masao Swanaga, SK-84 Hayate, clears the end of the runway and begins its climb into the pale orange haze. Below him, the sprawl of western Tokyo drifts by like a tapestry of smoke and rooftops. The morning light glints on canals and the charred ribs of factories hit in earlier raids. He levels off at 3,000 feet, scanning the southern horizon. The radio in his lap crackles with half-formed words, voices shouting bearings, altitudes, then dissolving into static. Far to the south, faint silver reflections have multiplied. They move fast, too fast for bombers. Swanaga keys his transmitter. Control, this is Blue Leader. I have multiple contacts, low sun reflection. Confirm identity. A pause, then the strained reply. Blue Leader, ground radar cannot classify. Target smaller than B-29s. Speed unconfirmed. The captain's hands tighten on the stick. He feels the vibrations of the P-45 engine, a living heartbeat under his boots. He glances at the fuel gauge. Full. The airspeed indicator trembles near 260 knots. He pushes the throttle slightly forward, and the world tilts. As he climbs past 10,000 feet, he sees them clearly for the first time. A dozen, perhaps more, single-engine fighters, sunlight flashing off polished metal wings. They fly in a tight, disciplined formation. Swanaga stares. They aren't Zeros, not even Navy aircraft. And they are far too sleek to be P-38 Lightnings. The gleam of aluminum, the long nose, the broad laminar wing, none of it fits any profile he knows. A voice cuts through the static. Lieutenant Watanabe, somewhere off his right wing. Captain, I see them too, single-engine fighters, but that cannot be right. Swanaga's mouth is dry. He checks his map. The nearest American base lies over 600 miles away. No fighter can fly that far, fight and return. It's aerodynamically absurd. And yet the impossible glints of silver grow larger. Blue Leader to all units, prepare for intercept. His wingmen respond, their voices tight. The formation fans out, each pilot clinging to the doctrine drilled since Manchuria. Turn in pairs, attack from above, save fuel for home. But as they close within 5 miles, the unknown aircraft bank sharply toward them. Swanaga's stomach knots. Instead of fleeing as overextended escorts might, the strangers come on with a predator's confidence. He catches a glimpse of their markings, white stars in blue circles and long-range drop tanks beneath each wing. The Americans. Control, he calls. Fighters, American fighters, over Tokyo. The reply is lost in a storm of interference and fear. A voice from another frequency cries, "They're attacking Musashino factory. Repeat, fighters, not bombers." Swanaga sees them roll into a dive, their propellers flashing like spinning mirrors. Gunfire stitches across the sky. He pulls the throttle forward and dives to intercept. Below, columns of smoke rise where the Mustangs, though no one yet knows their name, have struck. The sound of their engines is sharper than any Japanese machine, a metallic howl that cuts through the thunder of the B-29s. The first dogfights of the morning erupt over the western outskirts of Tokyo. Civilians on the ground pause in terror as silver and green trails cross above them. For the first time in the war, they are seeing enemy fighters roaming their own skies. Swanaga climbs again, seeking altitude advantage. He spots 2 of the silver aircraft turning toward him. He banks hard left, feeling the G-forces press his body into the seat. Tracer rounds slice past his wingtip, a warning, a promise. He returns fire instinctively, orange streaks crossing the air. The enemy banks away, not fleeing but repositioning with cold efficiency. At that moment, he understands something no tactical briefing had prepared him for. These pilots are not fighting at the edge of their range. They fight as if fuel is limitless, as if home is only minutes behind them. He glances again at his fuel needle. It's already dropping toward 3/4. They've flown barely 20 minutes, and yet he will soon have to turn for home. The radio erupts with calls for help, for bearings, for answers. No one has them. Control reports contacts over Haneda, then over Musashino, then over the heart of the capital itself. An entire nation's air defense network is buckling beneath the weight of the unthinkable. Swanaga levels his fighter at 15,000 feet and finally sees the battle spread out beneath him. smoke plumes, spiraling contrails, tiny flashes of gunfire. And there, directly ahead, a single silver aircraft turns toward him, closing fast. He cannot know the name of the pilot, Major Robert W. Moore, nor that Moore has flown from a volcanic island called Iwo Jima, 675 miles away. All he knows is that a new kind of war has arrived. As the two fighters rush toward each other at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour, the dawn over Tokyo erupts into flame. The two fighters close the distance in seconds. Suwanaga's thumb finds the firing stud. The twin 12.7mm guns and 20mm cannons hammer a heartbeat of fire across the sky. Orange streaks pass beneath the silver machine. The American answers with 8 streams of 50 caliber Fury, a solid white curtain of light. At the last instant, both men roll away, vapor trails twisting into a corkscrew against the crimson clouds. Suwanaga feels the weight of 5 Gs crush his chest. His vision narrows to a tunnel, edges blackening. When he levels, the silver fighter has already reversed course, climbing toward him again. He expects the American to break off, to save what little fuel must remain after so long a flight. Instead, the stranger presses the attack. Suwanaga dives, counting seconds, listening to his engine scream. The enemy stays glued behind him, perfectly matched in speed and turn. "Impossible," he whispers. "You should have turned back at the coast." Below them, Tokyo flashes in fragments. Rail yards, the black river of the Tama, the reflection of fire in broken windows. Civilians look upward as the sky unravels in silver arcs. At 15,000 feet, Major Robert W. Moore levels his P-51 Mustang. Inside his headset, the calm voice of Captain John Hampshire cuts through the noise. "Blue flight, maintain formation. Drop tanks now. Prepare for close engagement." The metal cylinders tumble away, catching sunlight as they fall. Moore grins behind his oxygen mask. He still carries more than 200 gallons of fuel, enough to fight for an hour and fly all the way back to Iwo Jima. The machine beneath him hums steady, its Merlin engine drinking fuel with the precision of a metronome. He banks left, slotting behind the Japanese fighter that has turned to meet him head-on again. The Hayate is fast, agile, desperate, but Moore's Mustang is faster still. The two aircraft spiral upward through thin cirrus, their engines roaring in counterpoint, one guttural, one metallic. For a moment they are twin comets over a burning world. Suwanaga's eyes flick to the fuel gauge, less than half. He's fought for only minutes. His radio crackles, someone shouting coordinates, then static. He knows what it means. The fuel that once defined Japan's air strategy, short, sharp strikes within safe range, is running out. The American dives. Suwanaga turns to follow, the Hayate trembling under strain. The Mustang pulls up abruptly, forcing the Japanese pilot to overshoot. In that heartbeat, Moore squeezes the trigger. Bullets punch through metal and fuel. A thin vapor trails from Suwanaga's right wing. He jerks the stick, rolls, fires back blindly. For a second, the two aircraft pass so close that Suwanaga sees the white star on the enemy fuselage and the pilot, gloved hand steady on the throttle. Then the Mustang climbs away, untouched. The Hayate shudders, smoke thickening behind it. Suwanaga levels out, heart hammering. The radio is a storm of voices, reports of factories aflame, of silver fighters chasing through clouds as though tethered to invisible fuel lines. He knows the pattern of defeat when he hears it. He glances once more at the horizon. The city he swore to defend lies beneath a curtain of smoke and dust. Somewhere out there, the new American fighter still hunts. He presses the transmit key, his voice calm, though his hands tremble. "To all units, their fuel does not end." The words hang in static. A tracer flashes past his canopy. Instinct throws him into a roll. The wounded Hayate protests, wings creaking. He sees the silver nose swing onto him again, steady and relentless. The final burst rips through the Ki-84's fuel tank. Fire blossoms across the wing root. Suwanaga pulls the canopy release. The handle sticks, refuses. He tries again. The flames crawl along the fuselage like a living thing. Below, rice paddies flash by, mirror pools reflecting smoke and sky. For an instant he feels weightless. The engine coughs, stops. Silence. The Hayate strikes Earth in a distant field outside Tokyo, throwing up a column of dust and flame that merges with the dawn. Major Moore banks once above the smoke. He does not gloat, he has seen too many enemies die this way. He checks his gauges, ample fuel, engine steady, and turns his squadron north to rejoin the bombers. At Chofu Airfield, Sergeant Yamamoto waits beside the empty runway, hands still blackened with oil. The engines overhead fade into the distance, leaving only the wind through shattered glass. He does not yet know that his captain will not return. By 7 o'clock, the battle over Tokyo is already ending. To those who survived, it feels less like defeat and more like awakening. The moment they realize that no distance, no ocean, no calculation will ever again keep the war from their doorstep. The crimson sky that greeted the morning now glows with fire. From the air, it seems the whole horizon burns. For the men who fought beneath it, this was the dawn of a new age, the morning when distance died. In the weeks to come, pilots and engineers will speak of fuel efficiency, of Merlin engines, of external tanks and aerodynamics. But those who were there remember something simpler, the feeling of seeing the impossible, bright and silver, crossing the sky above their homeland. For Captain Masao Swanaga, the war ended not with surrender but with revelation. He had glimpsed the future of air power, swift, tireless, inevitable. And for Major Moore and his comrades, the flight home to Iwo Jima is long but calm. Behind them, Tokyo smolders in silence. Ahead, the Pacific stretches endless and empty, the color of polished steel. The world has changed, though neither man will live to see its peace. Thus ends the first chapter. The sky turns red. The Mustangs left Tokyo as if they had never been away. In formation, they slid northward above the smoke and chaos, their silver wings tracing flawless lines across a sky still warm from battle. The engine settled into that steady, economical hum that only seasoned pilots learn to trust. The sound of a machine that knew itself and its limits. Major Robert W. Moore rode in the lead, his jaw set beneath the leather of his oxygen mask. The adrenaline of combat eased into a professional calm. Over the headset, a dry voice confirmed the squadron's status. 2 fighters damaged, all others green, homebound. Behind him, in the belly of a V formation, Lieutenant John Hampshire thought of the tanks that, just minutes before, had fallen like silent moons through the morning air. The drop tanks had done their work. They had extended the reach of a single-engine fighter beyond its traditional limits and now hung like discarded thoughts, tumbling into the haze below. The flight back to Iwo Jima would be long, nearly 700 miles over the vast blue of the Pacific. Yet none of the pilots spoke of fatigue. They were busy with a ritual older than engines, checking gauges, scanning horizons, and keeping watch for flares and enemy fighters. What these men couldn't fully appreciate, at least not in that first hour of quiet return, was the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The mission planners' charts, the metallurgists' notebooks, the endless hours of testing in wind tunnels, those details belonged to other men. For the pilots, it was simpler. A successful mission, lives spared, bombs delivered. But history, that quiet and relentless judge, was already making its note. To understand how a single-engine fighter could reach Tokyo from Iwo Jima and return, you have to look beyond the men who flew them. The Mustang's story is an engineering triumph, a tale of international collaboration. It's the story of an airframe designed by North American Aviation, married to the heart of another nation, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and rebuilt for American manufacturing by a company called Packard. The P-51 wasn't just about speed or armor. It was a study in balance. It had a laminar flow wing that sliced through the air, reducing drag. It had a clever radiator system that curiously even produced a bit of thrust. But the true revelation, the quiet mathematical miracle, was the Merlin engine. When adapted to the Mustang's slender nose, the Merlin achieved a rate of fuel consumption and power that granted the aircraft an endurance previously unimaginable in a single-engine fighter. When engineers bolted 2 external tanks beneath the wings, they didn't just add fuel, they changed strategy. The tanks extended the Mustang's combat radius into a whole new category. Very long range, pilots could now escort bombers all the way to their targets, jettison the empty tanks for combat, and still have enough fuel to fly hundreds of miles back to base. On the morning of April 7, 1945, each Mustang carried the combined confidence of these innovations. They were instruments of strategic reach, and the men flying them felt the advantage keenly. Speed, firepower, and endurance braided into a single, winged argument. Back on Iwo Jima, word of the mission rippled through command nets. In the operations room, officers scrubbed the reports. Factories struck, 7 enemy fighters down, our own losses and uncertain. The numbers didn't quite fit the old models. Paper couldn't contain their surprise. Major Moore's log that day would read like any other. Times, headings, the bitter scent of cordite. But for the planners, a new question arose. Could this mission be repeated? If so, the implications were nation-sized. The protective buffer of the ocean no longer existed. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the radio rooms were a scene of controlled chaos. Rear echelon officers paced with telegraphs in hand, asking questions that had no satisfying answers. From where? How many? Are they from carriers? High Command convened urgent talks. For decades, Japanese planners had measured safety by distance. The ocean itself was a part of their defensive architecture. That architecture had just crumbled. This wasn't a sudden whim. The voyage to Tokyo was the end product of years of refinement, of pilots pushing envelopes, engineers pushing tolerances, and logisticians solving the brutal math of fuel and weight. The US had learned from the vast Pacific distances that air power was only as good as its reach. The answer wasn't a single invention, but the patient combination of many small improvements, until the result felt like magic. As Moore's Mustangs crossed the bright Pacific, the men traded quiet barbs and exhausted laughter. Still, their eyes watched the gauges and the horizon. They knew they were flying a new category of aircraft, both weapon and herald. Word of the mission's success would travel by rumor long before official channels confirmed it. On both sides of the Pacific, the strategic implications began to settle. For American planners, it meant new options. For the Japanese, it meant a new kind of fear, as a nation that believed in the logic of its remoteness now faced a vulnerable new reality. By late morning on that fateful day, fragments of an unbelievable truth started trickling into Imperial General Headquarters. The initial reports were brushed aside as simple clerical mistakes. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo? Impossible. But as the day wore on, the evidence mounted like falling ash. Pilots from Haneda, Tachikawa, and Chofu all told the same unsettling story. Sleek silver aircraft with long noses and unusual underwing tanks. These planes fought with a ferocity they hadn't seen before, and then, instead of turning west towards carriers, they climbed eastward, back out to sea. At noon, Lieutenant General Masaru Kawabe gathered his air staff. He listened in stony silence as the communications officer read from a scorched dispatch recovered from Musashino. It confirmed their worst fears. The attackers were indeed American fighters, and they had departed toward the open ocean in the direction of Iwo Jima. Kawabe slowly removed his spectacles, gazed out the window at the gray spring sky, and whispered, "Then the sea no longer protects us." Within hours, the chilling implications cascaded through every level of Japan's air command. Flight instructors at Aquino scrambled to rewrite training manuals. Maintenance crews debated new fuel loads, as if more gasoline could somehow conjure more hope. Even propaganda officers found themselves at a loss for words, struggling to reassure a nation that had just been stripped of its comforting illusion of distance. For the older generation of aviators, the psychological impact was devastating. They had built their careers and their confidence on the simple fact of geography. In their minds, the Pacific was a vast, unbreachable moat. But that morning's events had introduced a new, terrifying arithmetic of war, one where mathematics and metallurgy could shrink an entire ocean into a single afternoon's flight. The younger pilots, hearing the stories from the soot-streaked and bandaged survivors, felt a disbelief that slowly curdled into dread. "They didn't turn back," one wounded airman recounted, his voice raspy. "They fought as if their base were just behind our own lines." Meanwhile, on Iwo Jima, the P-51s returned, touching down one by one in perfect order on the narrow volcanic strip. Ground crews waved flares and shouted directions as the first Mustang rolled to a stop, its propeller slowing to a blur of sunlight and oil mist. Major Moore climbed out of his cockpit, the Pacific wind whipping at his flight suit. He pulled his goggles down and looked back towards the horizon, where Tokyo lay invisible 700 miles away. He still had enough fuel for another 100 miles, maybe more. After crossing a third of an ocean to fight and return, the thought felt almost indecent. Captain Hampshire walked up beside him. "It works," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. Moore just nodded. In that moment, on that baked volcanic rock, they both understood. The very geography of the war had just been redrawn. Mechanics swarmed the aircraft, their movements practiced and urgent. They counted bullet holes, checked fuel lines, and listened for the faint ticks of cooling metal. They found the tanks half full. By any measure of previous conflicts, it was a miracle. That evening, the debriefing tent glowed with lamplight and the weight of exhaustion. Pilots spoke quietly, almost reverently, about what they'd witnessed. Some described the columns of smoke rising from Tokyo's factories, others the desperate skill of their Japanese adversaries. Major Moore spoke last. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "we went farther today than any fighter squadron in history, and came home with fuel to spare." There was no applause, only the quiet scratching of pencils noting flight times and ammunition counts. But beneath the routine, a profound realization was taking hold. The P-51 was no longer just an escort. It was a strategic weapon, an idea forged in metal. For American planners on Guam and Tinian, the implications were just as vast. They could now protect their B-29 bomber fleets all the way to their targets and all the way back. The lonely, terrifying days for bomber crews facing Japan's defenses alone were coming to an end. The Mustang would be their guardian, a long arm of protection stretched across the sea. Far away in a dimly lit room in Tokyo, the same realization took a much darker shape. The staff at Army Air Force headquarters gathered around a long table where range charts had been pinned since 1943. A junior officer took a red pencil, placed its tip on Iwo Jima, and slowly drew a circle. As the crimson arc reached the mainland, the silence in the room became suffocating. The circle didn't just encompass Tokyo. It swallowed Nagoya, Osaka, Hiroshima. Every industrial heartland of Japan now lay within its reach. In that instant, the empire's final illusion of sanctuary vanished. The sea, once a measure of safety, now measured only vulnerability. Rumors filtered down to the civilian population, whispered in breadlines. American fighters now reached Tokyo from the sea. Housewives began to watch the sky with a new kind of anxiety. Children playing in the ruins would point at contrails with a sense of unease. The military press, of course, claimed victory, but in private memos, the truth was stark. We face an enemy who defies our calculations. Countermeasures must be conceived anew. The search for those countermeasures bordered on desperate, from dispersing factories to building underground airfields. But none could solve the fundamental problem. No relocation could outpace the incredible reach of the Mustang. A Japanese colonel, Fujimoto, wrote in his diary with a kind of grim admiration, "The Americans have achieved the unity of man and machine that we once dreamed. Their pilots ride the sky with no anxiety of fuel. They are free. We are bound by tanks that empty too soon." Back on Iwo Jima, Major Moore lay awake, listening to the surf. He thought of the Japanese pilot who had turned to face him over Tokyo, the courage, the futility. In another world, he might have saluted that man. War, he realized, was measured not only in victories, but in the distances it forced men to cross, not just over oceans, but within themselves. Thanks for watching. Morning returned to Tokyo on April 8th with a strange quiet. The raids had ended, the sirens were silent, but the memory of silver wings lingered in the sky. Smoke still rose from the Musashino aircraft plant, drifting east toward the sea. In the neighborhoods below, people collected shell casings as souvenirs, strange tokens from a sky that had betrayed them. At Army Air Headquarters, analysts worked through the night, their calculations refusing to change. The conclusion was unavoidable. The American fighters had flown more than 1,300 miles round trip and still had fuel to spare. One exhausted colonel summed it up in a single devastating phrase: "We have reached the end of distance." In the days that followed, Reconnaissance flights desperately searched the Pacific for the aircraft carriers they believed must exist. They found none. Only the volcanic scar of Iwo Jima, captured just 5 weeks earlier, offered an explanation. The Americans had turned a rock into a runway and distance into a deadly strategy. From that island, the Mustangs came again. April 16th, April 19th, May 3rd. Each mission pushed deeper into the Japanese heartland, each proving the first was no miracle. The rhythm of war changed. Morning brought contrails from the south, a brief thunder above the cities, then the receding hum of engines bound for the horizon. Pilots who had once trained to defend the coasts now patrolled over their own farms and schools. The homeland sky, once theirs, was now contested air. For the Americans, this new range rewrote every plan. Bombers that once flew alone now traveled with guardians. Casualties fell, missions increased. The P-51 Mustang had turned geography itself into a weapon. The numbers told the story better than any official report. 51 very long-range missions between April and August, 341 Japanese aircraft destroyed, for only 62 Mustangs lost. But the truer measure was invisible, the slow, crushing erosion of morale. Master Sergeant Isamu Sasaki, a veteran with 38 victories, wrote in his journal, "After April, we stopped believing the sea would save us. We still fought, but the heart was gone." Even among civilians, resignation replaced defiance. The question was no longer if the Americans would come, but when. The contrails became the new calendar of the war. In May, Imperial headquarters considered a desperate plan: disperse aircraft factories into mountain tunnels. The order went out, but the work was too slow. The raids were faster. Every dawn seemed to bring the metallic thunder of the Mustangs, hunting trains, convoys, and anything that still moved along the Empire's veins. For Japanese pilots, each interception became a final act of defiance. They flew knowing they could not reach the enemy's base and might barely reach their own. Yet they flew, bound by duty and a fading dream of honor. American pilots respected that courage. Reports from returning squadrons often noted the skill of their opponents. In their own way, both sides fought a mirror of the same war: men against mathematics, courage against calculation. As summer advanced, the Mustangs multiplied. Iwo Jima became a mechanical colony, its black volcanic sand turned silver by aluminum wings. Engineers extended runways and stacked drums of fuel ever higher. The island buzzed without pause. By July, the air over Japan belonged to them. They escorted bombers by day, prowled the skies by afternoon, and returned to base long after sunset with tanks still half full. Range had become abundance. A Japanese pilot who survived these months later described the silence after combat. A silence filled not with relief but with realization. He compared it to listening to the sea after the tide has gone out, knowing it will never come back. When the war ended, Mustangs still circled the defeated cities, their shadows sliding across the ruins of factories they had helped to create. In later years, historians would call the P-51 a perfect aircraft, praising its engine, its range, its beauty. But for those who lived through the spring of 1945, perfection was not the word. They called it inevitability. The Mustang's arrival over Tokyo was more than a battle won. It was the moment when human intention outran geography. The machine proved that the limits once thought permanent, the vastness of the ocean, the reach of fuel, could vanish in the space between invention and will. And so, the world entered a new age, one measured not in miles, but in possibility. For the pilots who saw them that morning, streaking over Tokyo like new stars, one question would echo for years: how did they get here? The answer lay not just in engines or fuel, but in the unyielding human desire to reach farther than yesterday allowed. By August 1945, Japan's sky had become an open road for the P-51 Mustang. The silver fighters that once appeared as apparitions over Tokyo were now a daily presence. They escorted B-29s north, roamed the length of Honshu, and prowled the railways that carried what little fuel the Empire still possessed. The Mustang had fulfilled its design and then exceeded it. Every morning its engines rose from Iwo Jima's volcanic runways with a sound that promised the inevitable. By then, even Japanese civilians recognized the pitch of its approach: higher, cleaner, more confident than the droning bombers that followed. For the pilots of Japan's dwindling air forces, the missions became exercises in sacrifice. They flew obsolete aircraft on fumes of gasoline, sometimes ramming when ammunition ran out. They no longer measured victory by survival but by delay, an hour stolen from defeat. Meanwhile, at Iwo Jima, the Americans worked in tireless rotation. The island that had cost so many lives in March now thrummed with machinery. Fuel drums stacked 3 high, tents aligned in perfect grids, and the roar of the Merlin engine never ceased. The pilots slept in the same foxholes that Marines had dug 5 months earlier. They ate powdered eggs, listened to the surf pounding Mount Suribachi, and joked that the sand itself could catch fire. Between missions, they polished their aircraft, not out of vanity but out of reverence. The machine had become their assurance of return. Each new sortie extended the experiment. Missions once deemed theoretical, to Osaka, Nagoya, even Hokkaido became routine. Combat radius was no longer just a circle on a map. It was a horizon that moved outward with every improvement in planning. In Washington, planners began drafting operations that assumed complete command of Japan's airspace. The B-29 Superfortress, once alone in its peril, now flew in an armored procession, guarded by squadrons that could meet enemy fighters far from the bombers' vulnerable bellies. One by one, Japanese cities burned. Industry crumbled under precision attacks directed by unopposed spotters in the sky. The few surviving interceptors fought with valor but without effect. On July 24th, Major Moore led what he would later call a patrol of silence. No enemy fighters rose to meet them. They flew the length of the main island and saw only smoke columns and the dull flashes of anti-aircraft guns that no longer reached their altitude. In his logbook he wrote, "The war feels finished, only the paperwork remains." At that same hour, hundreds of miles away, Japan's cabinet debated surrender. To them, the air war above their heads was no longer battle, but inevitability translated into noise. The Minister of War asked a single question: if we sign, will they stop the fire from the sky? The Mustangs made their final combat runs in the first week of August. By then, atomic fire would take the place of incendiaries, but the pattern of domination was already set. The P-51 had rendered the Empire defenseless before the bombs ever fell. When Emperor Hirohito's voice finally reached his people on August 15th, it was carried over a radio network that buzzed with interference from American transmitters. Outside the palace, citizens looked upward out of habit. The sky was empty, quiet, owned. At Iwo Jima that same day, the airmen gathered under a tattered flag. Moore stood with Hampshire and the others, eyes fixed eastward. They had flown their last mission. The horizon that had once meant fear now meant home. They spoke little. War, after all, ends not with shouts, but with exhaustion. The Mustangs would remain on the island for months, their aluminum skins dulled by salt and dust. Some were ferried onward to the Philippines. Others sat in rows until the next generation of jets replaced them. Yet each machine carried the ghost of that first long-range flight, the proof that distance had ceased to be a defense. The weeks after the surrender were filled with a quiet unlike any Japan had known. The sound of aircraft still droned above, but now it carried no fear. The same Mustangs that had once raked the sky with gunfire now cruised slowly over ruined cities, mapping, photographing, watching. Their shadows slid over rubble and over people who had learned again to look upward without terror. The occupying forces arrived like a tide. Engineers, surveyors, medical teams, interpreters, all moved through the wreckage that had been an empire. Among them were men from the Army Air Forces with notebooks and measuring tape. They sought not treasure, but understanding. The remains of Japan's aviation industry, the lessons hidden in its failures and its final acts of courage. At Tachikawa Air Arsenal, American officers found wrecked prototypes and blueprints singed at the edges. Japanese technicians, still in grease-stained uniforms, guided them through the debris with a kind of weary courtesy. For the first time, enemies spoke not through gunfire but through instruments and diagrams. One of the interpreters later wrote, "They asked how far we could fly. We asked how they made their engines breathe so far." Both sides were speaking the same language now, the language of range, of endurance. In the months that followed, The P-51 itself became an ambassador. Dozens of Mustangs were ferried to Japan for liaison and patrol duty. Their polished surfaces mirrored the rising sun of a conquered nation. Children in schoolyards watched them with curiosity, unaware that these same wings had once haunted their parents' nightmares. For the engineers of the New Japan, the sight held another meaning. They studied every technical report the Americans allowed them to read. In time, they would build their own machines again, but the blueprint of the Mustang lingered in their minds, a template of efficiency and purpose. Meanwhile, on Iwo Jima, the airfield quieted. The wind scoured away the black dust from the runways. The tents of the fighter squadrons folded one by one. A few Mustangs were left behind, stripped for parts, their logbooks ending abruptly with the words, "War over." Major Moore flew his last sortie in September, a routine weather patrol over the same sea he had once crossed to war. He looked down and saw the Pacific calm and endless, no longer a battleground but a mirror. When he landed, he shut down the Merlin engine and listened as it ticked itself cool. He wrote only 2 sentences in his journal. The machine did all that was asked. We learned the sky was smaller than we thought. In the United States, factories that had produced the Mustang ceased assembly within months. The design was perfect for its war, but war's end and perfection ages quickly. The jets were already whispering at the edges of invention, the Shooting Star, the Meteor, the Schwalbe. Yet every new shape carried the same truth the Mustang had proven, that the power of flight lay not in speed alone but in the marriage of endurance and precision. The statistics that reached Washington were cold but eloquent. In 5 months, the P-51 had flown more than 10,000 sorties from Iwo Jima. Over 90% of bomber missions to Japan had enjoyed fighter escort. The bomber loss rate had fallen by half. The numbers were celebrated as victory, but to those who understood, they were also an elegy, the farewell to an age of short-range flight. Historians would later call this period the twilight of propellers. For one brief, magnificent season, the Mustang stood at the summit of piston-driven achievement, a bridge between eras. Behind it, the slow crawl of early aviation. Ahead, the scream of jets. In Japan, the surviving airmen were demobilized. Some became farmers again, others mechanics. A few vanished into the anonymity of a rebuilding nation. Captain Swanaga's name appeared on no roster. His aircraft had burned outside Tokyo months before. Yet among his comrades, the story of that last duel endured, a symbol not of loss, but of the moment the world changed beneath their wings. American correspondents arriving to document the ruins sometimes asked Japanese officers what had broken their will. The answers varied. Fuel shortages, blockade, the bomb. But one major of the Home Defense Air Service answered differently. "It was," he said, "the day we saw your fighters over Tokyo. We realized then that even the air belonged to you." Thus, the Mustang's victory was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. It ended a war of distances that had defined the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. What had begun as an oceanic siege concluded as a contest of reach, and reach in 1945 belonged to the silver wings of Iwo Jima. On September 2, 1945, the guns of the Pacific fell silent. The gray battleship Missouri rode calmly at anchor in Tokyo Bay, while the representatives of a fallen empire stepped forward to sign the instruments of surrender. Above them, in the blinding morning light, a formation of B-29s and P-51 Mustangs passed in ceremonial flight, symbols of the air power that had delivered victory. To those on the deck, the scene felt almost unreal. 4 years of fire and sea compressed into the rustle of papers and the scratch of pens. Yet overhead, the sound of engines reminded everyone present that power no longer belonged to fleets alone. The empire that had trusted in distance watched as distance itself vanished into the drone of aircraft passing above. In the weeks that followed, the airfields of Japan filled with silence. Fighters sat abandoned in rows, their tires sinking into mud. Mechanics who had once tuned engines for battle now dismantled them for scrap. The smell of oil and cordite gave way to rain and rust. American technicians catalogued each wreck and blueprint, marking them for shipment or destruction. Their reports were brief, factual, but behind each number lay a story. The exhaustion of a nation that had flown as far as its fuel could take it. The Mustang, meanwhile, continued to fly, first as an occupation aircraft, later as an instructor's tool for young aviators learning the craft of controlled power. In the calm after war, it was a machine almost too perfect for peace. When the pilots of the Iwo Jima squadrons were finally ordered home, they stood one last time beside the aircraft that had carried them across the Pacific. Many placed gloved hands on the wings, as if saying farewell to a living companion. The propellers spun down, the engines coughed once, and the age of the long-range propeller fighter came to rest. The Japanese people rebuilt amid the ruins. American administrators walked the streets that the Mustangs had once strafed, this time carrying clipboards instead of sidearms. Children learned English words, factories learned new designs. From those same workshops, a generation later, would emerge aircraft of peace, machines that crossed oceans not with bombs but with passengers. Historians often measure wars in battles won or cities lost, but the quiet revolutions of technology leave deeper marks. The P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers. It closed the greatest distance on Earth. It turned the vast Pacific, once a moat protecting nations, into a single field of operation. From its first flight over Tokyo to the surrender in this same bay, less than 5 months had passed. In that brief span, the logic of geography, the idea that oceans defined safety, was erased. From that erasure grew the modern age, global, connected, inseparable. Those who flew the Mustang rarely spoke of conquest. They remembered instead the discipline of flight, the precision of engines, the strange beauty of dawn seen from 15,000 feet. To them, victory was not the fall of an enemy, but the mastery of a distance that had once seemed endless. For Japan, the lesson was equally profound. The empire built on distance discovered that innovation could leap oceans faster than armies. In the decades to come, that lesson would be rewritten as progress. The same nation that once resisted American machines would master and surpass them in peacetime. But in the spring and summer of 1945, there was only the sound of engines, the final argument of a war defined by reach. Today, the P-51 Mustang rests in museums, its metal polished and silent. Visitors walk beneath its wings and read the small placards: range, speed, armament. Few realize that these numbers once changed the shape of the world. If distance once defined human limitation, it was here, between the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima and the burning skies of Tokyo, that limitation ended. The Mustang was the proof that courage, imagination and machinery could conspire to shorten the world. And when the last of those pilots closed his logbook, he left behind more than numbers. He left a new understanding of the Earth itself, that no place was truly far, and no dream unreachable. Thus ends the story of the P-51 Mustang and the morning when distance died.